Hello, everybody, again. Nick Broomfield. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. By the way, I think it's amazing how you always pull rabbits out of the hat and do these unexpected events.
Oh dear. We're going to start, now he's going to start interviewing me, so this is going to be very, very tricky because we're very close friends and we're being told very specifically to try and keep on script.
All right. Okay. By the way, the only thing Armani didn't give me is the socks, which I think are a big disappointment to the general. I just wanted to apologize.
So yesterday we were on the radio. We were on the radio together with Marianne in her Stroppy show. And she asked us to tell a story about traveling together, and which I'm only mentioning now because Nick has these socks on. So we stayed at a very, very expensive hotel in the south of France once, which was, I mean, very, very, very grown-up hotel, very expensive. You had to play by the rules, and you know. And we were given a big suite right on the front, looking down over the water. And the manager of the hotel was a real bastard. But he was like, please, you have to dress for it. I said this to Nick, because I'd been to this hotel several times. I said, look, you have to dress for dinner, you have to be at lunchtime, you have to wear the correct things, and blah, blah, blah. We descended for lunch on the terrace of this hotel, and Nick arrived wearing cut-off jean shorts and climbing boots. And then the hotel manager ran towards us and said, and we looked up at the balcony, and Nick had put his underwear and socks and everything on the balcony to dry.
It was so expensive to get any laundry done. Yeah, I think Charles's comment was, you look like a mixture of the Khmer Rouge and the village people.
Anyway, we've known each other for many, many decades and had a great, more than quarter of a century, and we've collaborated on many of, I've just, poked my nose in occasionally, but Nick is, as you know, probably, in my opinion, one of our greatest filmmakers, whether it be documentary or feature film. He's extraordinary. And he's also been incredibly inspirational to filmmakers like Michael Moore and many, many people who have actually followed his style, which is to weave a documentary story and find the truth within it, in the 90-minute narrative particularly. And in the weaving of that is where his genius comes out, sometimes in the most sort of fascinating ways, in an extremely interesting and funny, often, way of getting deep into his subjects, whether it be in The Leader or Eileen Wuornos. And this style of interpretive documentary filmmaking, where the filmmaker is in the documentary, and it's made often on a shoestring, became something that was really emulated through cinema all over the world, both in Japan, in the US, and here, which you probably look at in the TV, you see many people doing it in a more clunky way. And so working with him over these decades, he's taken on subjects that were sometimes, first of all, really challenging and dangerous, like Tupac and Biggie, for example, where his life was threatened, and other films where we had equally dangerous situations. Life-threatening situations. And so he was very, very brave, and we can talk about that in a second. Anyway, his films, which I hope you've all seen, include, I have to have this piece of paper because I'm almost senile. So The Leader, his wife, and the driver's wife. The Leader.
The Leader, the driver, and the driver's wife.
Which is already complicated to say. Kurt and Courtney, which I hope you've seen, where he was threatened by, we can talk about that in a bit. Heidi Fleiss, Biggie and Tupac. Eileen, Whitney, Ghosts, and many, many films that we'll get into. Anyway, Nick, your father, Morris, let's start with that. Let's start at the beginning here. He was a wonderful photographer. Was this connection to film, even though it was still film, the reason you went to film school that inspired you to go on this journey?
I think it was, I was kind of very influenced by some of the writing of Jack London, actually. He he wrote these sort of in-depth books about the East End of London and other things. And I was kind of fascinated what it would have been like to have made a film then, because it was sort of almost a documentary report about the East End of London. And then I was very influenced by, I guess, the writing of Tom Wolfe and Hunter Thompson, that sort of gonzo journalism where you're kind of looking at a subject, but you're also immersing kind of the telling of the story in the subject. So you get it's almost like the fourth wall where you're kind of moving the boundaries back. So, and sometimes you get a much better portrait, I think, that way of quite complicated situations. Like, I think there was that amazing story about, Frank Sinatra has a cold, which, it wasn't Tom Wolfe, but I can't remember the writer's name, but he went to interview Frank Sinatra, and then the interview becomes incredibly difficult. And all these people keep coming up with excuses. And then so you get a real portrait of Frank Sinatra's entourage and this amazing place he lives in and all the obstacles you have to go through. And he kept putting off the interview, and then you realize that Frank Sinatra has a cold, but nobody wanted to come out with that. And so you just get this portrait of a very, very complicated individual who's so, sheltered. And anyway, it was the definitive portrait, I think.
Like the telling of the story becomes the story, basically.
And then I saw a couple of films that I thought were amazing. There was a film called Waiting for Fidel that a guy called Mike Rubo did, where he goes to meet Fidel Castro, but actually never meets him. And the guy who's putting up the money for the film keeps fighting with Mike Rubo. He can't understand how he's shot so much footage and he hasn't met, Fidel Castro. But what you get is a portrait of Cuba and partly filmmaking, but also you get a portrait of this leader, Castro, who definitely doesn't want to meet the filmmaker and just sort of puts off all the interviews and so on. And it's a very funny portrait of Cuba. And then there was a wonderful film called Sherman's March.
Oh, yeah.
By Ross McElwee, where he ostensibly is filming Sherman's March across the South, but it's really a review of his own love life at the same time. It was, again, sort of just a different way of telling a story in a very amusing way.
What do you prefer, funny or serious? Because you've done both.
Well, I think both. I think, I think humor is great, and you don't want to just hit an audience on one level. I think, you want to keep them entertained and interested, and I think often the humor enables you to understand people a lot better.
Do you think growing up in this, or being a child, would you describe yourself as a child of the 60s?
Well, I certainly grew up then. I would say that I had a pretty sheltered upbringing, really. But yeah, it was a time of, I guess, turmoil in ideas. There was a lot of a clash, I guess, of cultures, which was exhilarating, and a lot of questioning, a lot of searching for direction, I guess, in that time, which was...
That's why I asked that, because you search in these subjects and you have an openness which maybe today doesn't exist so much. Or what do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think, this is dangerous water to talk about today, because you're bound to say something that's going to offend half the audience. So
try not to, yeah?
Yeah, so try not to. This is part of our remit not to, right?
No offending any members of the audience.
No, I think we live in a very judgmental time, which is not great for creativity, I think, because everybody's very worried that they're going to say the wrong thing, particularly in a place like Hollywood where no one really has any belief anyway. So they're even more desperate to be saying the right thing, which means that they're very conservative at the moment about what they do and what they make and their opinions. So.
But I guess what I'm trying to ask you is that you went to film school, but you've broken rules from the very beginning. And in your first films, you know, your father was appalled, or I remember seeing in your recent film about your father, which you should all watch, which is wonderful. But people were sort of staggered that you had the audacity. Tell us about your first experience in breaking the rules of filmmaking as a documentarian.
Well, I think, you know, I went to the National Film School, and there was a wonderful man running the film school called Colin Young, who actually died earlier this year. And he was very kind of inspirational because he was actually a philosophy student himself, more than a filmmaker. And he was very interested in storytelling and telling stories in different ways, really. And he was particularly interested in telling the story of the filmmaker as well, that the filmmaker was part of the story, and the relationship that you had as a filmmaker with your subject was obviously a very telling thing. And, you know, how do you put this in? How do you move, how do you tell a more complicated story? And he showed us this film of a guy called, the filmmaker was called Mike McCarthy, and this was ages ago in Ireland, and there was this old guy cycling along the road, and he falls off his bicycle and disappears into the ditch. Mm-hmm. And Mike McCarthy obviously thought, what am I going to do? I can't just keep filming this guy. He's probably drowning in the ditch. So he puts the camera down on the floor, on the road, and runs over and pulls this guy out of the ditch. And for Colin, that was a seminal moment, because you suddenly saw the filmmaker actually cared about this guy, and it was in the film. And so he encouraged us to, you know, make films that kind of dealt with this sort of thing. And so actually, when I just left the film school, I made this film, you know, The Leader, the Driver, and the Driver's Wife, the title you're having a problem with.
Understandably.
And there was this sort of, it was a complicated situation. It was sort of just, you know, the apartheid regime was still in South Africa, and there was this very aggressive, militant leader called Eugene Terreblanche, who you'll see in this clip, who was, you know, basically fighting a campaign against Mandela and the end of the regime. He let bombs off in the airport. He killed lots of people in the townships. A whole bunch of his guys went into Bophuthatswana. And got, how do you do that?
I don't know, we did the leader thing already.
Right. And there was a big confrontation there, and a whole lot of people got... Anyway, he was a very kind of powerful figure at a particular time in South African politics. And Rita, actually, and who's here, Rita Ord, we ended up in this teeny place, Ventersdorp, where Terreblanche was based. And we just sort of set out to make a kind of home movie. So, you know, and the driver lived next to Terreblanche.
Let's show the clip.
What? Hang on a moment. I haven't finished yet.
I thought you were drying up. I was trying to help you along.
No, I wasn't drying up. So the thing was not to take Terreblanche too seriously, because he was a terrible bully. You know, his wife would appear with sort of black eyes and that kind of thing. And he would scream and shout and drank a lot, and, you know, was a thoroughly kind of unpleasant individual. And so I always thought he was kind of more like a bully comedic figure. So we kind of looked more for scenes that would, rather than giving him a political platform to come out with all his stuff, we would find scenes that revealed the real Terreblanche. So maybe we could
rather like sort of Chaplin and the dictator,
more
using humor to...
Exactly. So, you know, and some of these things were a little dangerous that we did. You know, I think we a few times thought we were going to get beaten up. In fact, the cameraman did, Barry Ackroyd, who's a very well-known cameraman who worked with Ken Loach as well, he actually got knocked out in one of the first meetings that we were filming. So there were kind of screwball people, these who were, you know, on the right wing and very, very militant and a bit crazy. So
let's see the film. I mean, it's important for you guys to see. If you haven't seen the film, at that time, it was the first of these sort of films where the subject matter was kind of belittled by exposing the frailties of their character. And it was very powerfully and extremely well received and a big, big success. But important if you're filmmakers or to see the genesis of how this form of filmmaking started. Play it again, Sam.
To make matters worse, we'd shown up late with JP's drum kit, and the leader blamed us personally for delaying the parade. In a particularly animated argument with my assistant Rita, he had actually accused us of trying to sabotage the day.
Excuse me, Mr. Tabaj.
Yes.
I'm sorry about the, mix-up last
But
night.
listen, my good friend, this is the last time that when of your purple, I don't mind whether it's a woman or not, be cheeky with me. You understand it? This is my country, this is my place, this is my day. And last night I said I don't want you people anymore here. This morning you have to speak to me, and the first thing you do is to take photos from me, before you even ask me if you are welcome or not.
I thought this was a parade.
And if you people will interfere today again, like you did yesterday, then I will put you out. You understand me? Yesterday, when we came from Ventersdorp, you even interfered with security. You passed my car 2 times and blocked the traffic so that the head of security cannot even see me. And you are just taking over. Who the hell do you think you are?
We were just trying to get a passport
You are.
shot.
Listen, I'm not working for your bloody company, okay? So you'll do the things which I like, not what you people like. Do you understand me, lady? You even interfered with security. My wife and my child was in that bloody car. So what do you ask now?
Well, we just wanted to take the parade, that was all.
Yes, but please see that you are not in the way of the parade himself. You can take some photos.
Unfortunately, you cut off the best bit, which was him threatening the cameraman. But anyway.
We did our best.
Yes. Yes.
So tell us about that.
Well, yes, he sort of lunged at Barry Ackroyd and accused him of being like a monkey hanging on a tree. With anyway, it's like telling a bad joke.
Mm. But were you scared at that moment when you looked quite?
Well, yeah, because mainly some of the other. I think, fortunately, we became great friends with his security because they were always hanging out in the driver's kitchen, making smoke bombs and also drinking a great deal. So we became friends with them, and so when some of the other followers wanted to beat us up, they actually interfered. They saved us, basically. Wouldn't you say that was right, Rita?
Yeah. But you got to know him pretty well, Terre de Branche, didn't you?
We got to know him. I think we got to know a lot of his followers really well. And he was just a kind of, he got murdered a few years later in a really grisly way. He was just a pretty mean guy. But a lot of his followers, like the leader, the driver, although I think, one of the things with these films is to go in with a pretty open mind, not go in with a lot of preconceptions. So, JP, who was the driver, was actually, although he was a complete racist bigot, was a kind man, which is a hard thing to understand. But I think, you realize that people who are born in a particular political moment, in a particular political climate, have views that you might completely abhor, but they are a product of that time, which, doesn't mean they are mean people or they're bad to their kids or that kind of thing. So it was an interesting experience, which there were a lot of contradictions. I think we all felt very fond of the driver, for example, even though we completely disagree with an awful lot of the things he was saying. He really believed in he would go on about the white uniform, meaning our skin, and we would have endless debates with him. And you kind of realized that he was a product of living in South Africa at that time, in a small rural community,
I mean, I personally, in working with you and also looking at these films, I personally like the fact that you come in with such an open mind. Even working with a serial killer like Eileen Wuornos, you become sort of fascinated by your subjects. Do you have a premonition of that before you start in choosing? What's the process?
Well, I think I think you literally, I mean, I remember on this film, we were filming in a big meeting somewhere, and Barry the camera person somebody, bashed him on the head when he was filming. And it was actually the driver who tried to help us. So we went to Ventersdorp and we started a relationship really with him and his wife, Anita. And they were kind of funny, sweet people, who we didn't know anything about before. And so a relationship developed, and a lot of that relationship is obviously in the film. And I think the privilege, in a way, of making these films is that you don't go in with a script. I think documentary is completely the opposite to making a feature film. And the luxury of it is that you improvise as you go. And I think these days, particularly with the stuff the streamers do, it's, they write scripts beforehand, and in a way they defeat the strength of documentary, which is that it's improvised, it's spontaneous, and it's kind of much more like the Wild West, I think. And that's the attraction of it, is the moment that you seek to get. And the film is born out of the research, really, or the film is the research. You don't go in with a fixed idea and then go and prove a thesis. You go in with an open mind, and when you meet somebody complicated like the driver, who, on the one hand, if you were reading about him in The Guardian, you would hate him. But when you meet him as a person, you can actually relate to him on a level of humanity that you didn't expect. And I think that's what's so amazing about documentary, and what that has as a form, which is difficult to have in, when you make a documentary, you have, 3 months or 4 months maybe to shoot. And, very, very few journalists have that kind of time to do a story.
How much time do you prep for usually?
You don't really prep.
But in the research period?
Well, you might, actually, on that particular film, we actually went to South Africa to make a different film. And, the film that we went out to make wasn't really worth making. And I remember Rita called, I think it was Peter Moore at Channel 4 in those days, because we were there kind of illegally too, because you were supposed to apply for permission to film in South Africa, and we hadn't done that. And so, Rita said, the film isn't worth making, but we found this other film we'd like to make. And he said, is it a good other film? Which would never happen, I don't think, today. It's kind of like, everything's become a lot more corporate.
A lot more professional.
A lot more professional, probably. So I think that's what the documentary form, I think, has. I think that's its strength.
Tell us about Lily Tomlin, when you were making a movie about Lily Tomlin.
Because you do jump around.
Yeah, well, I've been jumping.
Well, that was actually, Lily Tomlin was a really bad experience. And I think it was that film that really convinced me to put myself into the film, because I think it was a friend of mine's doctor, who was also the doctor of Lily Tomlin, who kind of actually set the film, you know, Beverly Hills Doctor set the film up. And we filmed Lily preparing her shows for months and months and months. And I never thought Lily was that funny, but I kept saying to myself, well, other people find her funny.
She was a big comedian. I don't know if you know her.
She was in 9 to 5, and she's in a series with Jane Fonda at the moment. Anyway, we made the film, and you know, for weeks and weeks, Lily didn't even want to see us, and she thought her show was terrible, and that we were documenting a disaster for the world to see. Then the show actually was quite a success on Broadway, and then it was we were going to capitalize from her success and make a lot of money. So we then ended up in a dreadful lawsuit. And what we had really was a lot of great after-dinner stories about how dreadful the shoot was and crazy things that happened on the shoot. But none of it was in the film. You know, so we had this film, which I didn't think was particularly great at all, even though we were being sued for $11 million. And I thought, if only we'd put in the process of making this film, which was living in terrible motels in San Diego, and you know, all we'd see of Lily for a week would be her looking out of the curtains, seeing us and drawing the curtains again, you know. And we were meanwhile sort of just killing time in you know, doing stupid things. It could have been a much funnier film, I think, if we'd had that element in it. So when I started on the next film, actually, which was a film with Andrew Brownsburg. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah, producer.
He worked a lot with Polanski, and he worked a lot with Warhol. He was very kind of, you and Andy would get on very well. He's very eccentric, rather like you, and great fun. Mm-hmm. And so he wanted us to do a film about someone called Andre Heller, who was doing this big Broadway show. And the film started going really wrong. And Andrew, all the money started collapsing. And I said, well, I'm out of here. And he said, well, look, we've still got $800,000 and we're staying in the best hotel in New York. Surely we can do something with you know, when we're eating, what are you going to do for the next few months, you know? And I said, okay, you know, if you'll be in the film and I can film the financiers and the chaos of this show, you know. And so we made this film called Driving Me Crazy, which was pretty wacky. But sometimes I think when you take a big risk and you really don't know what you're getting into, your best work comes out of that. And it was really liberating for me to make it, because I suddenly saw a whole possibility of storytelling and filmmaking that I hadn't dared do before. I always remember Derek Malcolm, who was a big critic for The Guardian, saying to me, whatever you do, don't ask questions in your film. You've got this awful upper-class accent, which was a nerve, really, because he went to Eton and had a much worse accent than me. But, you know, you sound ridiculous in your films. So for a while, I listened to Derek, and then I thought, well, actually, I'm, you know, a buffoon too. You know, I can, you know, I think there's an element of humor one can get into these. And making documentaries, often the situations are absurdly ridiculous and hilarious, and you often think nobody really knows what you go through to, you know, to become close to these people.
To paint. I always think you're a painter in how you approach these subjects. You know, you really, because I'm living through the experience, obviously at a distance, as much distance as I can possibly get. But I can see Nick, you know, getting to know these subjects, you know, and then crafting the story through, like he was talking about, the driver. But, you know, in every case, I'd say, there's always a character that leads you through, that you become like a navigator or a cowbell that leads you through. And I think you're brilliant at that. I think that's really what... Before we move and show a bit of Battle for Haditha, I just want to talk a little bit about something that is happening a lot now in the documentary world, particularly, which is authorized and unauthorized. And so explain a little bit what that is.
Well, I think the British broadcasters on the whole, you know, Channel 4 and BBC, are much more sort of risk-taking than their American counterparts. And I think, you know, Channel 4 and the BBC have enabled me to make most of the films I've made by putting up the initial money to do films where you don't have the consent, for example, of the estate, or you don't have the consent of the particular person you want to make the film of. They're much more interested in that sort of journalistic, you know, search for truth and freedom and so on. Whereas, particularly, I think now in America, with the streamers being so corporate, really everything has to be legally watertight before they necessarily want to even start the film. You know, you have to have the authorization of the estate, you have to have the artist on board, or you have to have the politician on board. They're not keen on doing anything that could potentially come unstuck. And I think that's, you know, it's partly because they're all terrified of losing their jobs in a way maybe that people aren't quite the same way here, or they have a different tradition. But at the same time, I think often it's the questions that, you know, a particular person doesn't want to answer that are more revealing than the questions they do want to answer.
Like, for example, in Whitney, Nick made a film about Whitney Houston, and that was, you know, again, without the permission of the estate, because it was, you know, difficult to show what had happened to this extraordinary woman in a very real way, and how she had been exploited to some extent by the establishment. And, you know, it was, people were very angry. Talk to us a little bit about Whitney before I move on. Sorry to jump around, but I think it's important.
Well, I think, you know, what I kind of learned in doing the film about Whitney, who I really didn't know anything about before, I didn't even really know much about her music, was that she was a kind of creation of, what's his name, Clive Davis. That he had invented this sort of black American kind of goddess, although she was from Newark, from, you know, which was a riot-torn city with a great deal of poverty and drug addiction. He created this persona, which he mainly sold to white America. And then when she didn't live up to that persona, because she, you know, she was obviously with someone like Bobby Brown because he was very like her, and, you know, all her, you know, both her brothers were, you know, into crack as well. She was completely dismissed. And I remember, in fact, we were going up for a hike, and it was actually Charles who had the idea of doing Whitney. Charles is one of these people who has, you know, 50 ideas in a minute, and you have to selectively choose one that you think is a good one.
A heater would be good. A heater.
A heater would be good too.
Because it's freezing down here, just so you all know, it's freezing.
Anyway, Whitney was a good idea on that particular day. So, yeah, I never really thanked you for that. But anyway.
No, you didn't.
So you realize this whole other story.
Biggest hit, really.
You know. Yeah. But a heater would be good.
No, it's important, no, because, you know, what happens today, and I'll say this as a producer and as a financier, so what happens today is that basically, of course, you know, Beyonce can make a film that many of you probably saw, or Pamela Anderson can make a film, and they're in control of that. So they're showing you, you know, it's like a sort of publicity film. Of course, now I'm going to get, you know, in trouble with Netflix and everybody else, but I love you, Netflix. But actually, it's a totally different thing, because those things are, the subject is actually in control of the narrative. So they're showing you what they want to show you. And of course, there are little moments where Pamela's going to cry and miss her husband who beat her and went to prison for 2 years, which is a bit fucking weird, but okay. But for the most part, you know, what Nick does and other documentarians, Michael Moore, for example, that's a different thing. That's like an unscripted journey. And if any of you are filmmakers thinking about picking up a camera and doing something, at least you can do that with your cell phone now, which in those days you couldn't. You know, you'd spend hours and hours and hours with pouring through Moviola. Anyway, so that's important to note. You then sort of left the process of making films in your, usual way. In other words, either being in them or making them about particular subjects in a particular way. And you said, I'm going to make a war film. And I think a great war film, which we worked on together, but called Battle for Haditha. So before I do anything, let's show a clip of that, and then we can talk about that. Is that good?
Okay.
Play it again, Sam. Battle for Haditha.
We will bring to the Iraqi people food and medicines and supplies and freedom.
Hey, you know we found 119 IEDs? Every one of them insurgents we missed in Fallujah, they're here in Haditha, waiting for us.
Hello, my friend.
Hello.
DVDs. You must trust me.
I don't ask you for anything.
I'm gonna raid these two houses right here.
You know what that feels like? To run into a house, when you look down, you're covered in blood and brain, and then you realize that that's your friend? And I refuse to have to go through that again.
هذا أجركم الدنيوي وأجركم إن شاء الله عند الله سبحانه وتعالى.
أنا على أبوهم لا بنخلفهم، لك بس تليفونك، لا كهرباء لا مي، هاي حديثة اللي كانت تخبر.
قومونا قومونا. راح الإرهابيين يجون يقتلونا إحنا وجيراننا ببيوتنا.
Whoever did this shit is gonna pay for this, all right? We've all seen a lot of action at an early age. Y'all did what we were trained to do.
Democracy will succeed because the United States of America.
So this is a highly original way of telling a war story. None of those people it looks like a documentary, feels like a documentary, but actually they're actors. Or they're not actors. Tell us why.
Well, yeah, the idea, it was actually Peter Dale at Channel 4 was very interested in kind of using some of the documentary techniques in, making what's essentially a scripted story. So this story was, based on fact, and there were a lot of reports that the NCIS had done into this incident at Haditha. And then what we did was we actually got a lot of Marines or ex-Marines who had been in Iraq. And we built barracks and put them in these barracks, and then we found Iraqi refugees and created a sort of community for them. So they actually lived in the houses where I think we actually got some big families and stuff. And so the Marines were basically acting themselves within a kind of structured story, as were the families. And, we obviously had a mound of material as to what actually happened in this particular incident, and different groups that were involved. And we filmed it out in Jordan. So, right up, identical kind of landscape and so on to Iraq, right close to Iraq. In fact, it was so authentic that the Marines were all convinced I wanted to kill them. They thought they were in Iraq. And I remember asking them all out for dinner one of the first nights we got there, and they were actually terrified of going out from the barracks without their weapons and stuff. So the film very much, had all those elements of tension that probably, would have existed in Iraq, and a lot of very interesting relationships developed. So it was a kind of experimental form, and it was great to have that opportunity. It was great doing a sort of more action as well.
Wonderful film, you should see it. I'd like to show you a clip now of a totally different film, obviously, a totally different style and everything else, with Marianne and Leonard.
We are jumping around. I told you,
there's
at least 60 ideas in 1 minute.
We've only got an hour, so are you all okay? All right. So then they can ask questions and get...
Well, this was also... Excuse me one moment.
Well, please.
This was also supposed to be a kind of illustration of the other thing, about authorized and unauthorized. And the film that I did, Marianne and Leonard, was actually unauthorized. Which caused some problems afterwards. But I felt also gave access to a much more complete portrait of particularly Leonard Cohen and the 60s, which he was, very much obviously a part of in that particular time. And this particular clip is, very much to do with the sort of sexual politics of that period of time, the 60s and so on.
Why I jumped to it rather adroitly was because you applied a documentary style to war, and in this film, I think very successfully, you apply a documentary style to telling a love story. And so they're both highly original uses of your particular methodology. All righty.
On the wire, like a drunken song, old midnight choir. I have tried in my way to be free.
That's it?
That wasn't the clip I sent.
That wasn't the clip I saw. I'm sorry.
Jesus.
Well, you'll have to see the film. How weird is that?
Don't we have another clip?
Julianne, do we have another clip? Oh, shit. All right.
Oh, dear.
So I'm sorry about that. But anyway, the clip was meant to be much more interesting.
Very revealing clip.
It was very
Yeah.
That was Leonard Cohen. That would happen to us. The whole thing, 2 days, everybody's had perfect clips to illustrate. After we get Leonard Cohen, it's typical.
You cut down the first clip. Then this
I don't know what they did to the first clip. Anyway, Leonard Cohen was an amazing character, a good friend of mine, and who I made dinner for plenty of times. And Nick embarked on this story. So could you just take us through your history, meeting Leonard, just take us through the narrative, and so that we can at least fill in what wasn't seen. Not the whole movie.
That's a tall order.
All right, just take us through why the film and Haditha and everything else.
Well, you really want me to do that? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I happened to end up on Haditha aged 20. I'd been on this, okay, I'm going to go into all this indulgent stuff. You can just interrupt me and start asking questions if you want. So I'd been on this Black Sea cruise with all these, Oxford archaeologists and stuff, including the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Runcie, and his wife, who used to play knees up Mother Brown on the piano at night, and couldn't understand why I was on this boat. I was there because my father was lecturing on it too, and said, you've got to go to this island called Hydra when you get off the boat, because it was stopping in Piraeus, and go and have some fun there. It will change your life, you know, and forget us old farts here. Anyway, so I went to Hydra, and of course it was a crazy place. In fact, you know, the pension that I stayed in, the guests who were invited to stay in it were selected by people going to the boat, and anyone they fancied off the boat would be invited to the pension. So that was, you know, and the people running the pension were pretty crazy. And I met Marianne at a nightclub, I guess, a couple of days in. And I'd had a pretty, you know, I'd been to a Quaker school in Somerset and, you know, a pretty sheltered life. And so this was like one of the most beautiful places in the world. And it had, although I wasn't on the island for very long, it had a massive, you know, effect on me or influence on me. And I always thought at some point I would do a film on it. I, you know, met Leonard many years later. I didn't meet him on the island then. I just met Marianne. And Leonard was, I think, you know, going out with, I can't remember which actress, one actress. And he would...
There were a few. Yeah.
There were a few. And so he would always be sitting around at these awards events, not knowing what to do with himself. And, you know, we would chat mainly about Axel, Marianne's son, who was not in great shape. And then, you know, when they died very close to each other, I just, you know, because they were both such influential people, on me personally, I thought, you know, it would be an opportunity to do a film. And by that time, you know, Leonard's music was controlled by his estate. And I wrote to the estate initially and said, you know, I'd like to license these particular songs and blah, blah, blah. And the estate responded by wanting to know who was financing the film. And then it was like, and who at the BBC are you dealing with? And I realized that they were going to try and stop the film, you know, without really knowing anything.
Which was really absurd because the film tells the story. Marianne was a Danish, rather beautiful Danish lady, Norwegian lady, and living in Hydra, and it tells the story of her love affair with Leonard Cohen. So there's nothing offensive about this, and actually it's a really, first of all, it's a absolutely, if you haven't seen it, watch it tonight, because it's a beautiful movie.
Particularly after seeing that little clip.
Particularly after seeing the clip. Yeah. And if you don't know who Leonard Cohen is, buy his book too. But it was nothing offensive about this. It's like, let me make a film about this little moment of great importance in these two people's lives that you knew and respected, and yet every door was shut, and it became a battle because they were planning their own, you know, series of films. And this is a problem that we're facing because it, again, edits out what you're meant to see or not meant to see. And we don't like that. Well, I have had the most incredible journey working with Nick and the greatest privilege of my creative life. Nick Broomfield.